So, welcome. Thank you guys all for dialing in today. The topic is Harvest Moon, which is something that Moonbeam has just announced as of last Thursday, so it's relatively new. And since there was a lot included in that announcement, it seemed prudent to talk about it in a little bit more depth. So we have Derek Yoo, the founder of Moonbeam and CEO of PureStake, on the line, and he's going to sit with us today and help walk through some of the components of the campaign and what this means for the future of Moonbeam. So Derek, first and foremost, what is Harvest Moon? We've sort of talked about it on our Twitter, and we've been teasing it for a few weeks. But for those who maybe missed those messages or aren't caught up kind of on their social here, what is it, and what is it trying to do?
Sure. Can you guys hear me all right or no?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, Harvest Moon. So it's an initiative to build awareness in general for the Moonbeam ecosystem and all the great things happening in it, and specifically focused around some of the DeFi use cases, which frankly, DeFi use cases are still probably the most popular like developer use cases for Moonbeam. I mean, Moonbeam is a permissionless platform. You can build any kind of thing you want, but we have consistently found that teams building DeFi use cases are, there's that's probably the most prevalent focus area for development teams right now on Moonbeam. And as a result, that's a place where we as a team have spent a lot of time trying to understand how a lot of these protocols work, so we can best support these teams. And yeah, I think we're now reaching some pretty significant traction milestones related to those efforts as an ecosystem. And so that's really what Harvest Moon is about, is to kind of shine a light on all of the things that have been happening, and in particular, make sure that there's awareness for all of these things in the broader crypto space.
So you mentioned DeFi use cases. Can you give some examples when you're talking about DeFi use cases? Because there's been, obviously some projects in the DeFi sphere already deployed to Moonbeam for some time. So what kinds of use cases are you looking at for Harvest Moon specifically?
Yeah, I think the kind of the thing that's most recently happened that is quite significant from my point of view is that well, yeah, as everyone knows, the network launched back in January, so it has been in operation for some time. But really, in that time since January, there's been a lot of work behind the scenes going on to deploy additional like infrastructure, tools, services. I mean, we have this like large amount of teams that are developing apps or want to deploy the Moonbeam, and from them we've learned like all of these things that those teams need to be successful. And so, what I like to tell people is, Moonbeam itself, obviously the code base itself, the PureStick team has worked on is one element, but really like, it gets surrounded by all of these other things to make for like an actual functioning, platform that people can deploy to. And so some of those elements, came in a little bit earlier. So those are things like our Etherscan deployment, like a deployment of the Gnosis contracts for multi-sig capabilities. One of the things that happened most recently, though, is this integration of Chainlink to provide pricing feeds. This was like one of the top requested, pieces of DeFi infrastructure that quite a number of teams were waiting on. And so, and by the way, this getting a Chainlink integration these days is like easier said than done. It's like not that easy. There's a lot of there's a lot of chains out there these days. There's a lot of EVM chains, and so there's a lot of people competing to try to get Chainlink's attention to get them to deploy. Luckily for us, like we've had like a great working relationship with the Chainlink team. We've already collaborated together on the Moon River network and deployment, and we were kind of in queue from a long time ago to have this like integration come in. And so I think that was a big unlock. Then once the Chainlink price feeds were integrated, that was an unlock for teams like probably many of you saw that the team at Moonwell launched just last week, and that was another team that is a great team that's been building in our ecosystem that was kind of gated by or waiting for these Chainlink price feeds. So yeah, I think that those things or those events are things that were anticipated for quite some time. So I think that's a big part of the Harvest Moon timing is that a lot of these elements are now in place basically that many of the teams that we had spoken with were waiting on or had said that they needed in order to be able to deploy.
And I know you touched on this a little bit with Chainlink, but in terms of timing, obviously, Moonbeam has been sort of fully live for the last 6 months, and Chainlink has just deployed. And so when we're looking at Harvest Moon launching right now, how do you expect that to impact kind of the next 6 months? What do you anticipate to get out of this program?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I already mentioned some of the things that I do think that like broader awareness is definitely like one thing. And, I take that from two different angles where I think for, obviously one of our primary audiences is users that are in the Datsama ecosystem that Moonbeam is part of. And I would say there even that, the users that are in Datsama are not necessarily uh, DeFi specialized like users, right? So you have these like kind of DeFi specialized users that are often, spending a lot of time on Ethereum mainnet. And so I think that there is like an awareness component there to kind of spotlight like the different kinds of interesting things that you can do with your tokens right now that for this Datsama audience. But at the same time, on the other side of the coin, I think that we always see Moonbeam as this kind of I don't want to use the word bridge, but as this like easy entry point, right? So if you're not from this ecosystem and you're looking to like learn more or understand more, then Moonbeam represents this like easy way to that has a lot of familiar elements to it for someone coming from, let's say, Ethereum mainnet, right? Or you still are using MetaMask. You're still you're in this like environment that looks and feels and is very familiar to someone from either Ethereum mainnet or even let's say like Avalanche or Polygon. And so I think that that's like the one opportunity in front of us is to kind of highlight like all of the interesting things that we have going on in our ecosystem and make for a serve that role as being this on ramp, right, for these users that are outside of our ecosystem. And then once they're here, that's not just the immediate kind of interesting things that are DeFi related. Use that then as an opportunity to educate them about the broader like Datsama vision, right, around having specialized chains that can talk to each other. And so that's part of the longer the longer vision.
Great. And so there was actually this announcement was sort of a two-parter. And there was another pretty important component that was included in that, and I wanted to make sure we had time to discuss it because I think it is not necessarily intuitive. It's a shift forward, and so I think it takes time to kind of really explain what we're trying to do. And so that announcement was about connected contracts, connected smart contracts. Can you touch on what that term means and kind of expand on how you see this playing for Moonbeam moving forward?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think folks that are on this Twitter Spaces here will get a little bit of a preview of some of the points I'm going to make in the talk I'm giving at Polkadot Decoded in New York later this week. But yeah, it really speaks to this like longer game, right? So there's in the shorter game for us is obviously we have this a lot of these protocols, EVA protocols that are deployed that are mirroring in some cases existing forms, right? That like you can find like on in places like Ethereum mainnet. But the question for Moonbeam and for us is always, what is it that's unique about Moonbeam? What is it that's different? Like, what is it that we can uniquely bring to the table? Especially if we're comparing Moonbeam against like other EVM compatible chains, of which there are a bunch, right? I mean, there's not just Ethereum mainnet, but there's Phantom, Avalanche, and so on. There's other ones. And really the answer to that question, and really the reason why we even chose to build on Polkadot in the first place using Substrate, is this idea that the connectivity like between chains is critical capability, right? So if you buy into this idea that there's going to be many chains in the now and in the future, which there already are a bunch, but that there's going to be even more in the future, then this ability to connect like between chains in a secure way becomes this very very critical capability. And so when we talk about connected contracts, the idea and the vision for Moonbeam in the longer run is that from a smart contract on Moonbeam, we want to make it possible for developers to work with any asset, like any service that's like being provided by, let's say, like a specialized like chain, to work with any of these things, even if they're remote to Moonbeam. And then Moonbeam becomes this kind of glue, right? You can kind of work with all these different assets and services from different chains and combine them together to make an application that combines the best of all these worlds. And the thing that's exciting for me is that I've been talking about this vision now for like quite some time, for a couple of years, right, since we started the project. But now we're getting to the point where there's like actual teams that are like starting to use these capabilities, right? I mean, XCM went live like a couple months ago. We have the integration of other general message passing systems, such as the work that we're doing with like Nomad and Axelar. And there's teams now that like we already have a couple, some set of use cases are already shipped and delivered, and we have a bunch of teams and initiatives underway that are using these capabilities now to demonstrate like what I was talking about, to demonstrate this idea that you can have a set of connected contracts that power kind of an application that spans multiple blockchains at the same time. And I'm a huge believer that this capability, it's not that well understood right now because it's so new, but it's going to dramatically change the way that people build apps. And that we're in now the very beginning of let's call it like a 12 to 24 month period where these ideas are going to get broader and broader adoption, and people are going to change the way that they build apps to using these technologies, because it really solves like real problems that that people have. It's like challenges with like some of the existing approaches that people are taking to try to get to multiple chains.
Can you make that a little more real for us in the sense of, how does that impact everyday users, people who are already interacting with DeFi applications? How does their experience change?
Yeah. So, well, let me start with a before picture to explain, to just kind of set the stage of what it is that exists today, and then it'll make sense to say kind of how the approach using connected contracts is different and better. So, if I take like the state of the art today, is basically this. So, like I use the example sometimes of a protocol like Sushi. Now, Sushi is like a great innovator, like and in this like multi-chain vision, right? I mean, they were one of the first teams we started working with. They really have pushed the envelope in terms of what it means to be like a multi-chain DeFi protocol. And the key innovation that they had, if you consider back to when they started, back when they started, people really didn't have this like multi-chain vision, right? They just said you pick a chain, right? You pick one chain, you deploy to it, and then if you need to service other assets, you bridge them like to that one chain. And so I think the key Sushi idea was, what, like we're going to deploy to like many chains, right? We're going to basically like bring our app like to these other like markets, these other chains, and get like access to users and assets that are local to those chains. And so that was like a pretty big, like it was like a bold like innovation. And basically, if you look now, I think Sushi's deployed to something like 16 chains. They have like a bunch of like activity on like a lot of those deployments. And so I think that kind of moved things forward. And now it's almost expected now. I think if you're a DeFi protocol, the question is, well, what's your multi-chain strategy? Which chains are you deploying to? Like and then how are you going to like make sure to get access to all of these assets like that and users that are on on these in these different ecosystems. So that's the good. Like, what is like the challenge, right? So the challenge I would describe simply as one of fragmentation. And so what do I mean by fragmentation? What I mean is that you have fragmentation along a few different lines. Like, most obviously in the DeFi case, you have this like liquidity fragmentation, right? So you have these different deployments on these different chains. They're all like independent deployments, right? So they don't like know about each other. And sometimes you kind of combine them in the front end. So when you go to the front end, you might be able to pick what chain you're going to, but each instance of the protocol you're connecting to is like a separate instance, right? So then if you're working, if you deposit assets into one, like that has no bearing on what's happening on another one, right? And if you want to move, you're talking about like a withdrawal, then maybe a bridge over somewhere else, and then like a redeposit, like onto like another chain. And so you have this kind of fragmentation effect that happens. And by the way, that's not just liquidity. That's with the user experience itself, right? So and features. So one thing that kind of quite often happens is that you have an uneven feature set on the different deployments. For a lot of these protocols, they're home to Ethereum mainnet, or that was their home base originally, and so you have like a full feature set on Ethereum mainnet. But then if you go, going to another EVM chain, you might have a subset of the features that are available. So you kind of have this like first class citizen, second class citizen type problem, right? Where the other deployments are like not as feature rich as the primary one. And so yeah, you just have this kind of fragmentation effect that happens. And so I think so with that context, how does this connected contracts idea combat that? And let me just use like an example, and we can talk about more examples. But I've been using this example that I like quite a bit of a protocol called Prime. And so their idea is to use this connected contracts approach to have a set of smart contracts, and they have this kind of system that's on Moonbeam that has like let's call it like a master kind of accounting system, right? So they have this effectively this like smart contract database, let's call it, on Moonbeam, and then they have these remote smart contract deployments on a bunch of other chains. So that could be on Avalanche, Polygon, Ethereum mainnet, and so on. And the idea is that if a user, so it involves user deposits, right? So if a user deposits assets on, say, Avalanche, then the idea is that like these messages, like these smart contracts are all connected to each other. So when someone deposits on Avalanche, you don't move the assets, you just send a message back to this database on Moonbeam saying, hey, this user deposited this asset like on Avalanche. And so what that means then ultimately is deposits are happening is that this like brain or this like database on Moonbeam has visibility across all of the chains, like the state of like all of the chains, right? It understands like what deposits have happened. And so then that same user can go to a different chain, let's say Ethereum mainnet, and they can like, leverage the deposits that they made on Avalanche, like on Ethereum mainnet, right? By consulting this database and saying, hey, like what kind of like assets did this user deposit into the system? And so I think it's a good example because it shows this how it like the system, even though it's deployed on multiple chains, is acting as one system. And you can use like things that are happening on one chain to affect like what happens on another chain. You kind of avoid this need to bridge things around, right? And I think it really just it kind of counters this like fragmentation effect, right? So you kind of have this feeling that you're interacting with one thing, even if there's like multiple chains involved. So that to me is a hint of like what the future looks like, right? It's not this separate thing where you have to then be rebridging things around to chains. You're kind of interacting with one system, even if it's deployed across many chains.
So, for those who aren't aware, later this week, Derek will be speaking at Polkadot Decoded, which is, of course, the major Polkadot conference that's kicking off, I believe, on Wednesday, and will be both virtual and in person for those who are able to get a coveted ticket to one of the in-person locations. And so, as part of that, Derek, I know you're going to go into additional use cases, Prime, of course, being one of them, and also some involving other Polkadot projects. Could you maybe give us a preview of what you'll talk about, kind of what people can expect when they tune in for your talk on Wednesday?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to just even preview like some of the other scenarios. I think each of these scenarios is quite informative, and and I think what we're seeing right now is that it's the scenarios cut across different collections of blockchains, and so some of the scenarios are very focused on using XCM and different specialized chains within Datsama. As an example, the work that we're doing with Centrifuge. But some of the scenarios are actually spanning, Moonbeam and perhaps Datsama assets, but then out to like other chains, such as like chains in the Cosmos ecosystem, like Osmosis. And so, I mean, why don't I just talk? I can kind of preview this Osmosis use case. We did have an announcement recently about this, so it is public. That so we've been working with the team at Osmosis, and we have a partner of ours, Axelar, that provides a messaging capability that connects Moonbeam to other chains that are outside of the Datsama ecosystem. Osmosis being, an example of one of those chains. Axelar is itself like a Cosmos SDK based network. And so I think that, but the way to think of it is that it provides at least some similar functionality to what XCM provides, but across chains, that are outside of Dotsama. When you're using XCM, you kind of have these like very strong security guarantees. But for a lot of the developers we work with, they said, look, like we need to get at assets and send messages to contracts that are on like other chains that are outside of the Dotsama ecosystem. And so in this example of Osmosis, and for those of you that are not aware, this is an app chain. So this is a Cosmos SDK DEX. It's like it's a decentralized exchange that is implemented as its own blockchain. And as a result, they can do things that they can customize the chain itself, right, to kind of optimize for that use case. And for Sunny, the leader over there, the user experience is the key thing that he's always trying to optimize for. So he's made a bunch of optimizations like at the blockchain layer to support the best possible user experience for users of the Osmosis DEX. And it kind of shows, right? If you look on DeFi Llama, they have quite a bit of traction in terms of TVL and other things, of this DEX. I think largely attributed to this user experience. And so the discussion there was, well, how do we want to get like assets that like non-Cosmos ecosystem assets like into this DEX, right? So when you're using Cosmos, you can use IBC, which is their version of XCM. So there is this way to transit assets like between different Cosmos chains with very high security. But like obviously, like just as I was explaining, they need access to like other assets as well, right? So it would be quite limiting if they were only limited to Cosmos ecosystem assets. And so they ran this whole process. They selected Axelar as like the main, kind of partner that they will use to integrate like outside assets. And so we had this kind of partner in common. Now, the question was, okay, well, how do we get like DOT like as an asset like into Osmosis as a DEX, right? To like be able to deposit, for example, if a user wanted to LP, into a DEX pool that had DOT in it. And so the idea here is that there'll be this one-click deposit, right? So like a user on Osmosis would be presented with just a deposit like link, and I want to deposit DOT, and they'll be presented with an actual DOT like address, right? An address from the DOT relay chain. And then users can use, like, for example, Polkadot.js to make the deposit into this address. So what is it that happens like then? So then there's like this whole series of events is kicked off like once that is presented to the user. So once a user is presented with this DOT address and uses Polkadot.js to deposit, so that's kind of the DOT is picked up like on that relay chain address that's detected. It's like XCM'd to Moonbeam as XC20. Many of you on the call here may have done that before, where you can use our DApp, but you can also programmatically move DOT from the relay chain to Moonbeam to be XC DOT on a Moonbeam address. From the Moonbeam address, it's forwarded to the Axelar like router contracts. So this is like the place where you send assets if you want to initiate actions like on the Axelar network. Axelar like routes like that, that XC DOT, from Moonbeam all the way to Osmosis, which is its own Cosmos SDK based chain. And then from there, there's a deposit triggered, into an Osmosis transaction is triggered to like do the deposit like into the DEX pool. And so, you see there's like this multi-step process. I don't know what there was, like 4 or 5 different steps that are happening, upon deposit. But, from a user perspective, it's quite simple, right? They were just presented this DOT address. It's almost like magic, where Osmosis just had this ability to like present a DOT address, and then the right thing would happen. And the end result is that they LP like into like a DEX pool in this case. And so I really like this example because I think it speaks to one of the ultimate like reasons why this cross-chain integration is important. And that reason for me is that it's about improving the user experience, right? I mean, so think about if you were to do that manually, right? So if you didn't have this like this whole system setup I just described, you would have to manually like take your DOT from the relay chain, use the Moonbeam DApp to transfer it to XC, an XC DOT like on Moonbeam. You then have to do some kind of manual transfer, like over from the XC20 to Axelar for a bridging action, use their bridge. Then you separately go to Osmosis and then start to do like your deposit action. And so, I mean, that would work, but think about all the things you just made the user do and like all the things they need to understand to be able to do that. If you compare now against this, there's just this like dot address like you're used to. You just send like there, and then all of these other things happen, but they happen behind the scenes, right? They're like the user doesn't have to know about them happening. You're kind of hiding all this like infrastructural complexity like away from the user. And then, the effect of what they're trying to do is cheap, where it just gets deposited into this like DEX pool. I really like this example because to me this is like what the future needs to look like, right? There needs to be like less burden and less complexity put on the user. They need like you need to like have them. They need less knowledge, right? You can't have people like need to understand all these complicated like cross chain like protocols, bridging, assessing like risks on like different things. I mean, that's just like going to limit your user base. If we want to expand to the next billion users in crypto, we got to make this like easy. And I think it mirrors what's happened in just with like mobile apps and like in the regular Web 2 space, where the demand user are like decrease over time, right? You present them with like ever simpler like interfaces, and you hide like all of the servers, infrastructure, like messaging systems, all these things that are used to power the app. They get kind of hidden away from the user, and the users don't need to know all the details about it. And so that's this is a great example of that, and how cross-chain messaging is used to achieve that, right? This kind of dramatic simplification of the user experience.
I know you talked about, I mean, really quite a few applications that are already kind of in the works, but what do the timelines look like on this? You mentioned some are sort of already deployed, and you also mentioned this 12 to 24-month period for kind of cross-chain connections in general, but where are we in terms of the evolution of this technology and approach?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is a thing where, sometimes people don't realize, well, because like Polkadot has been launched for, the relay chain at least for some time, but really these like cross-chain features are quite new. I mean, so they've been available for a couple months, maybe, and even in that time, there's been some iterations as like, they've been refined and upgraded. And even if you look at a general message passing system, such as those that come with either with Axelar or Nomad, those are quite new as well. I mean, the Axelar general message passing functionality also is about the same time frame, it's a couple months old. And so yeah, so I think this stuff is quite new, but I'm quite encouraged by the development activity we see around it, because people are starting to understand what the power is of these things. And so we have a couple shipped use cases. The first use case we shipped was this XC20 use case, because it was just so obvious and so useful. And we already have a lot of traction on this XC20 use cases that uses XCM to move assets within the Dotsama ecosystem, right? And when those assets move to Moonbeam, they become usable as ERC20s within the Moonbeam EVM. And so that was the first thing we targeted, because it was being requested. Basically almost everyone we were working with wanted that. And so that was the first thing we shipped. I'll point out the Lido use case is also like in production now. So that's another great example of something that is usable today, which has a lot of the same ideas I spoke about in it, where the Lido use case right now on Moonbeam combines functionality from both Moonbeam and from the relay chain, right? So it's this combination of Moonbeam-based smart contracts, and then using this connected contracts approach to control or access like specialized staking functionality on the relay chain. And so you have this combination of these two specialized chains coming together, but to present one user experience, where the user just has this very simple interface for depositing DOT and getting out ST DOT, right, which is the liquid stake derivative version of DOT that they're providing. And so you can see echoes of some of this Osmosis use case in there as well, where they're hiding away this like infrastructural complexity away from the user. That's in production now. And then there's a number of teams that are in development now, and use cases that are in development now, using this this connected contracts approach to perform similar actions. And I would say that right now there's going to be in the second half, we're going to start to see these teams deploy and deliver these cross-chain connected like apps onto Moonbeam. And so that is definitely the thing I'm most excited about, because again, this is something that we've specifically targeted with Moonbeam. That's driven a lot of our design decisions. And it is something that I feel is quite unique to both Moonbeam, but frankly also to Polkadot and to Dotsama, right? This is the long game that the folks at Parity have played, working on this thing for like 5 years, is that they have this XCM capability now that can be used to do integrations, like I was just describing. And so, yeah, I think second half, there's a number of teams working on now that are leveraging these technologies. And I think our mission then for in the second half is to help spread awareness and educate developers about these capabilities. Because I do think that they're still quite new. Most people are still operating in this single chain development mindset. Even if they are planning to deploy to multiple chains, they're still saying, well, let me just start with Ethereum mainnet and I'm just going to develop there and then I'll worry about moving that to other chains. And I think, we want to say, no, that's probably not the right approach. You want to design in from the start this ability to be on multiple chains at once. And so, there's a big educational component, like on our end, to help educate developers about what's possible. And I do believe that these cross-chain connected apps are they're inherently more efficient and better than like some of the existing apps, right? So I think that that's going to be ultimately the driver, is that they're more efficient, they're going to be more competitive than their solo chain kind of counterparts, or apps and protocols have been designed just to be on a single chain. And it's really this user experience, right? So like, in my mind, it's just critical that the user experience improve if we want to grow the number of users using these applications in Web3, and that's what's going to drive the whole industry forward. So I see that this work that we're doing is kind of really just tied into that we're helping developers create these superior user experiences, and that will like lead them to getting more users and traction, and ultimately to drive like this whole thing forward. That's how I'm thinking about it.
Great. And just to bring this back around too, in terms of some of the initiatives that have happened so far, and what we're looking forward to in the next 6 to 12 months in particular. We did just launch in kind of between the Moonbeam Foundation and Arrington Capital a new ecosystem fund, and part of that is meant to really help find and help project teams that want to work on these kinds of use cases. And so I know, among the projects that they've been working with, they did mention that Moonwell was one of the first projects that they funded through this ecosystem fund. And so I think, as we look forward, this is important, not just in terms of, Harvest Moon will continue to bring in new users and get folks excited about DeFi projects on top of Moonbeam and on top of Polkadot, but also offering all sorts of resources and kind of serving as a junction point for projects that want to experiment a little with these new possibilities that are opened up through teams like Axelar and Nomad and others that have allowed us to leverage some sort of cross-chain messaging functionality.
And
Any other?
I'll
Go
just
ahead.
jump in also on one thing, because I have gotten this question before of like okay, I mean, I understand, this vision of cross-chain connected applications, but how does that square with DeFi protocols, for example, that are deployed on Moonbeam that don't do that yet, right? That are more in this, are operating basically like in just the EVM itself. That could be dexes, lending, borrowing, and what have you. And the answer is, of course, that like all teams like in Moonbeam will have now access to evolve their protocols to take advantage of these things. But I would also point out there is a subtlety where, even to develop some of these cross-chain use cases, you need like these other DeFi protocols there as like building blocks. So I think a lot of these DeFi protocols become like base building blocks that are needed to build these like other protocols on top. And so this is something that we're always finding, is that there's kind of this like stackability, right? Where as things are developed, they provide a basic service, but then they in turn become a thing that can be built upon. And so we're seeing a lot of that these days, where all these things that we've done to date, a lot of the things that are initially the focus of Harvest Moon are now in turn becoming building blocks of their own, for people to build these like new use cases on top of. And so that's pretty cool in my mind, right? This thing where it's both a thing and a building block at the same time.
Yeah, I think the conversations we'll be having, even just, a month or two from now, as more teams emerge, will be quite different than I think the ones we're having now, where a lot of it is, we can see kind of the projects in motion, but once these are kind of more easily available for users and sort of enthusiasts within the ecosystem to see and play around with, the questions and I think the things they build on top of those will be quite interesting. All right. Well, so I kind of have run through most of the questions for the day. Do you have any other final thoughts you wanted to add in, Derek?
I mean, I would say that obviously a lot of the folks that are listening in here are part of like our community. So I think you'll start to see more in the way of us, around messaging, around like education related to some of these connected contracts ideas that I shared in this in this Twitter Spaces. And so yeah, it'd be obviously like we've come a long way based on your guys like support and help in like us spreading the message. So I think that would be the thing I would ask you guys to keep a lookout for is as we're kind of promoting these ideas, they are new, right? And there is this component I mentioned of just needing to educate people. And I think that once I have a chance to explain to someone, a developer, like what's possible, then there's kind of this aha moment where people say, "Oh yeah, now I understand. Oh, like I can make an app on Moonbeam that can work with any asset, like on any of these other chains, and I don't need to like go deploy it to like all these different chains like separately." It's just there, at the we need to figure out a way to kind of almost like industrialize that and make sure that we can spread that idea out like to like other teams. And so I think as we're developing more materials and coming up with more ways to do that, this is something that I would ask for help from our community here, all you guys that are on this call to help us drive that message, because I think it's a very powerful one, and I think it's something that's going to lead to a lot of like growth and opportunity on Moonbeam itself.
Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you, Derek, for your time. For those who want to learn more about Harvest Moon, you can go to moonbeam.network. There's a link, of course, at the top of the page, but also in kind of the header there. And that will give you more information about the campaign, as well as some of the ways that individuals can get involved. If you have more specific questions, please feel free to comment on this Twitter space with your questions, and we'll do our best to get to those. Thank you again, Derek. This has been great. And this recording, of course, will be available as soon as we can make it available.
Yeah, thanks everyone.